EQUIPOISE versus DECA compared to test. When to use EQUIPOISE and why. So people are like, what the fuck are you talking about, Todd? So the bottom line is everybody thinks that because Dan Duchesne said in the Underground Steroid Handbook 2 in 1984 that EQUIPOISE is like DECA, only better, that's what it is. And they're nothing similar. They're completely different. EQUIPOISE is actually a lot like testosterone and nothing like DECA at all. DECA is a completely different ballgame. The irony is DECA is known for joint, that it's supposed to help with joints. That's because it's got a large glucocorticoid binding, so it has an anti-inflammatory effect. But it means it binds where cortisol would in theory to some degree too. It does increase collagen synthesis by 240%, so it should help with joint issues, but EQ does 340% at a lower milligram. And it doesn't have any of the glucocorticoid binding. So they're really completely different. Of course, DECA is a nandrolone, causes prolactin to be released, and as you know, when prolactin goes up after you get your heart on the first time, if you lose it, you can't get it again. So it's not good for a lot of stuff. So prolactin's released with DECA and tren. So that's why the prolactin-releasing nandrolones, DECA and tren, are their own subcategory, because you have to have a whole bunch of separate rescue agents on hand for those. So we're going to focus on EQ. So EQ is known as EQUIPOISE for equine, for horses, because it's known as a horse steroid. It's veterinary grade, given to horses because it's supposed to increase endurance. Endurance increase is most likely due to the increase in red blood cell quantity. Although they've proven red blood cells are increased with EQUIPOISE, along with the collagen synthesis, so that, well, what are hooves and made out of? Collagen, yeah. Yeah, so basically, you know, for horses, EQ's the shit. So if you feed them right, they're going to have nice, healthy hair, hooves, joints. They're going to have endurance from running a lot. EQ is supposed to increase appetite. I find that EQ is weak as fuck. All right, and here's why. If you were to compare EQ to DECA, EQ's got a binding strength of 1, just like test. So when it binds testosterone or EQ binds to the androgen receptor, it's got a 1 magnitude. That means it's going to get a 1 efficacy. That means how strong does it stimulate that cell to produce muscle? Whereas DECA is insane. It's like a 1.54. And I think tren's only 1.35. But tren's got a 5-fold potency, whereas the other ones have about equivalent potency. Potency is you multiply the potency by the milligrams to get the relative milligram when compared to testosterone. So a testosterone has a potency of 1, and so 100 milligrams of testosterone is equivalent to 100 milligrams of testosterone. EQ on paper's got a potency of 1. I say EQ's potency is like 0.5. That, in other words, to get 1,000 milligrams of test, you'd need 2,000 milligrams of EQ. Or if you were on, let's say, 500 milligrams of test and you wanted to be on 1,000 milligrams of test, but you don't want all the DHT and estrogen conversion, you could run EQ, which doesn't convert to DHT and very minimally converts to EQ, estrogen, and then cancels itself out later, and that's really complicated. I'll get to that in a second. You would end up using like 1,000 EQ to make up that 500 test difference. So it ends up being more expensive, so no one ever ends up using it. So EQ really is just something you add in a little bit of to get some collagen benefits from. And that's pretty much it, collagen. And so where am I going with this endurance stuff is if it increases red blood cells carry more oxygen. It's going to give you more sluggish, thicker blood. So you're going to be more tired. This is something that someone brought to my attention just a few minutes ago, and that's why I decided to do the video, is that they brought that connection when no one could ever figure out why if you ran more gear, you were more tired, EQ specifically. And no one could ever figure out, like, if EQ actually had more red blood cell production than others, or was it just tested for red blood cells because it's known for endurance. But if you really ran a study comparing DECA to EQ to Anadrol versus Tren versus Test, and compared them based on their potency, and you did all the math to figure out their equivalent relative concentration in the bloodstream and potency, whether one is actually stronger than the other at stimulating red blood cells. Well, if at a milligram per milligram basis you're more tired on EQ than anything else, it would then stimulate that it makes your blood thicker than the other ones because it's more viscous, which would mean you'd either need to be on more water and sea salt to help dilute your vascular tree to allow for the increased red blood cell transmit, or you just would have to just admit that, hey, it actually does boost red blood cells more than the other ones, and that's why it makes you more tired. So ipso facto, if you're really tired from running a shitload of gear, not only are you just tired, but you're also running the risk of stroke because your blood's super thin. So you'd want to get some blood drawn, or you'd want to have increased water and increased sodium so you could dilute the blood, although that would increase your blood pressure and then run the risk of a blood pressure related stroke. So that doesn't really help either, now does it? You'd have to have increased vessel pressure over time to cause an increase of vasoendothelial growth factor and more vessels to occur. Or BPC, but we don't know any type of human studies that have tried BPC at all, let alone long-term studies, or how long-term usage of vascularization of the brain would cause any type of changes there. You either get smarter or you get deader, who knows, but it ain't going to be what we predict. It's one of those things where you get hurt for a couple days, you use BPC, inject it into that target, and you know you're growing new vessels in that target, but that target is a ripped tendon muscular insertion. It's not like you're just going to put them in your bloodstream and hope it goes everywhere and hope that vessels everywhere isn't a bad thing. I mean, increased vessels to a tumor would make the tumor grow faster, so that you don't necessarily just want widespread increased vascularization of all tissues. Ipso facto, where we're going with this is test relative to DECA, relative to EQ. For joint health, EQ. DECA is known to do some heart damage too. So the whole idea that DECA is harmless compared to other drugs, it really isn't. It's dirty as fuck. I really don't like DECA. I mean, it's effective, yeah, because of that binding effectiveness. It's gonna bind strong, you're gonna see results quick. But on the relationship side of things, unless you have everything lined up to ready to go in case you start having issues, and you know exactly how many milligrams to use and how many minutes beforehand and all that other stuff, it's just not worth juggling that. You're better off just sticking with test, and if you have to, using EQ to fill in the gaps to avoid the DHT conversion of the test or the estrogen conversion of the EQ. Earlier I mentioned that there are 4 things the EQ converts into. EQ convert into one test, which is 2 times stronger than normal test. It doesn't convert into DHT like normal test does. It converts to estrogen, but it also converts to an anti-estrogen. So that over time, that anti-estrogen that it converts into inhibits SHBG and aromatase, so that conversion to estrogen would go down. So that in conversion, in theory, if there's 4 doors and you close the door, and the other 3 doors increase in number, right? So as you increase the amount that you go down door number 3, not door number 4, and door number 3 permanently closes door number 4, the number of thousands of times that happens over time, the amount of anti-estrogen that accumulates from EQ dries out your test cycle. So over a long period of time, EQ will dry out the whole cycle you're running. That's why people say EQ doesn't show results for 16 weeks or so. Is really the only benefit they're looking for from the EQ is a strong anti-estrogen benefit that takes a long ass time to run. So if you're running EQ at a super low dose, like 200 to 300 underneath a full cycle, over an extremely long period of time, since it's so harmless, all you're really going to do is improve your joint health and decrease the amount of estrogen conversion, just as if you were running a Arimidex at maybe a 0.5 milligram a week long term, only, and then using glucosamine and chondroitin. Just for more bang for your buck, 200 milligrams of EQ is going to go a lot longer and a lot farther than having to actually buy something over the counter, because over the counter prices increase because of bottling and marketing and labels and all that stuff that your bathtub juice guy you get your shit from at the gym doesn't have to worry about all that stuff. It's like $2 to make a bottle, and he sells it for 80 to 100. So he doesn't give a shit. It's like, a label. Okay, fine, I'll put a label on it for 10 cents. It doesn't mean shit. So that's where your cost effectiveness of the EQ comes in, is that EQ for building muscle is not cost efficient. You have to use 2 to 3 times as much of that as something stronger, like 3 times as much as you would have to use of, if you're going to add in, let's say, DECA, you'd have to add in 3 times as much EQ. If you're going to replace test, you have to replace twice as much EQ as you would test. If you're going to try to run EQ instead of trend, you're crazy. There's no comparison. So, and then as far as orals, it's a complete apples and oranges. EQ is the longest of the long actings, and orals, the only advantage of orals is they can be kicked in really fast, like in a couple minutes. So you take it before the gym, you hit the weights, the oral's wearing off by the time you're leaving the gym. So that's where all that stuff factors in. So again, EQ's big benefit of joint benefits and endurance would come from low doses, and the anti-estrogen benefit comes over long term. That's why they say EQ's a 16-week cycle type drug. And again, EQ is nothing like DECA at all chemically. In any way, you couldn't take more 2 different drugs.